you have some commitments from the EU and also a little bit from Japan of actually going further than the tariff barriers and saying, actually, we are willing to commit to invest a certain amount in the US.
You've got China to US West Coast down 59% since June the 1st, and into the US East Coast down 43%. Carriers aren't going to take that line down, are they?
For every loaded exported container from the US to China, there is just over 9 containers, loaded containers, going from China to the US.
Welcome to The Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistics leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. I'm joined today, as always, by Senior Shipping Analyst at Xeneta, Emily Stausbøll, who's fresh from swimming across the Lake of Geneva last week. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Phil. Happy to be back on dry land for now.
I bet you are. An amazing achievement it was too. Right. As always, we say we're going to talk about something, don't we, during the week, and then something happens that means we have to talk about tariffs again. And this week is no different because we are recording it on, 29th of July. And on Sunday, we had the EU-US tariff announcement of the 15% tariffs. And we also have the ongoing US-China negotiations in Stockholm this week, where we've got kind of rumours of an extension to the tariff deadline. So, Emily, we were going to talk about backhauls, weren't we? Which is a less often talked about subject, and we're really excited about talking about it. We still will do, but we need to talk about tariffs as well.
Absolutely, because that keeps changing all the time, and you keep coming back to it again with new developments and trying to figure out actually what's going on at the moment. And I think we come back to something we've said a lot over the past many months now, is that the deals that have been announced is better than the worst case scenario. Remember, we were talking about EU tariffs, or rather US tariffs on EU imports of 15 or 30% at some point. I think 50% was floated. So of course, to say 15% is much better than that. It's obviously higher than the 10% that's been in place in this kind of truce period. But 15% is a high tariff, but it's more manageable to deal with. Trade can continue with this. And then it's a question of how much do importers absorb those extra costs versus how much they pass on to the end customers. And I think we're still in the early stages of kind of seeing the effects of tariff being passed on into the cost of goods to customers. That is only going to pick up going forward as more and more shippers kind of deal with these tariffs coming into force. You can no longer front load to the same extent, and they really have to start making those tough decisions.
Yeah, but when we spoke briefly earlier today, when we were kind of discussing the breaking news, have you just fallen into the trap here of saying it's kind of good news? The 15% is still 15%, isn't it? It isn't good news. It's just news that isn't as bad as it could have been. You know, it's bad, isn't it? You know, we can't frame it as anything else.
Yeah, I think there comes a certain point where, you know, of course it's still bad compared to what the situation was before, but we have to kind of move on from that stage and deal with what the reality is. So sitting here and sort of crying about the spilt milk doesn't really help anybody. We take what we can give. There's still a lot of uncertainty around this deal. And of course, there's a whole list. I mean, there's the vast majority of the rest of the world still doesn't know what tariffs they will face when these pauses kind of end. And that clearly is still a lot of uncertainty. So yes, 6 months ago, we would have seen this as a bad situation, but we're past that now, and we have to kind of look forward and see how we can deal with it.
That's a very positive outlook for you, Emily. But even the China tariff situation, there's the ongoing negotiations in Stockholm, but that's not going to return to a level that the cost of importing goods from China to the US isn't going to return to a level that we had before April the 2nd and when the reciprocal tariffs were rolled out, is it? So it's, I know you're saying about not crying about spilt milk, but at the same time, you've got a load of milk on the floor. It's not, it has been spilled, hasn't it? And it's not, it's going to cause a real issue.
It's very, very difficult for anybody sort of trying to deal with these tariffs, but it's the reality now.
Sure.
But I think maybe just one other part of this, which is interesting, is alongside kind of the tariff commitments, you have some commitments from the EU and also a little bit from Japan of actually going further than the tariff barriers and saying, actually, we are willing to commit to invest a certain amount in the US or buy a certain amount of US goods. For the EU in particular, that's, I think it was $750 billion worth of energy goods, which, of course, for the US is a way of saying, okay, we're going to narrow our trade deficit and we've got these extra non-tariff commitments. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. Those of you who were sort of following the trade war back in 2019 will remember something similar that happened with China back in 2019, when you kind of put the trade war on hold back then. And that was China saying, we will buy $2 billion of additional US goods. A lot of that was agricultural goods. At the time, I was covering not only container shipping, but also bulk shipping, and spent an awful lot of time thinking about soybeans. And following that kind of change, we did see China import more soybeans, mostly because their imports had dropped to zero during when tariffs were first imposed, but they didn't meet those commitment levels. Of course, by the time that became clear, Trump was no longer the president and things had moved on. But it's kind of coming back to something that we've seen before, and it'll be interesting to follow. But energy exports have not really got a huge impact on the container market.
Yeah, well, and let's talk about that. Let's talk about the impact on the container market. 15% tariff EU goods into the US. Is that going to be the kind of, the spark that will prompt shippers to really, or not even shippers, but is it going to be the spark that just puts life into that trade lane, whether it's kind of consumer demand for those goods, or shippers eating the tariff? What we're going to see in terms of container shipping demand and therefore rates on the transatlantic.
So I think, like I said earlier, we've still yet to see kind of how the tariffs fully impact prices. We're still in kind of that pre-period where a lot of importers are eating those costs, or they're using the goods they've front-loaded. I don't think 15% is suddenly the trick that says, excellent, we'll buy everything we possibly can from Europe. That's not the reality. 15% is still a significant price increase if you pass that on fully to customers, but it's not as bad as it could have been. But I definitely wouldn't expect this to spark kind of a cargo rush on the transatlantic. We're beyond that, and we have yet to see exactly how the tariffs impact consumer behavior. But that is likely to come in the coming months as shippers and importers sort of figure out, okay, how much of these costs can we pass on? Because they're not going to be willing to eat it forever.
No. And, the transatlantic is a bit of a kind of, it's an undramatic trade anyway, isn't it? In terms of, it doesn't move in the same kind of dynamic way as other trades. So, but we are still seeing, there has been a decline on the transatlantic, hasn't there? But if we look at trans-Pacific trades, it's a lot more dramatic, and the decline in rates has been more,
It's a very interesting trade because it's probably the most consistent trade in terms of how it follows the development on Trans-Pacific, on Far East to Europe rates. It tends to lag by 2 or 3 months. And then, of course, if the development is stagnating on those main trades, then the increase isn't as big on the transatlantic, and same thing on the decline. But actually, we're dropping now, and that's kind of matching what we saw a few months ago now, or in mid-June, with the rates collapsing on the Trans-Pacific. And that's now kind of feeding into the transatlantic as carriers adjust the capacity they have deployed on the different trades.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because when we talk about if carriers are trying to protect rates on the Trans-Pacific trades, and I'm just looking at the data here, the Xeneta data, and you've got China to US West Coast down 59% since June the 1st, and into the US East Coast down 43%. Carriers aren't going to take that line down, are they? And they are going to shift capacity, and we've seen the impact that it had from Far East into South America East Coast recently. I think it was 200. It was north of 200% increase, wasn't it, on that trade? So this isn't. I suppose the point I'm making is, this isn't something that these tariffs aren't something that just impacts the US trades. You've got whatever is happening into this South America East Coast, within Asia itself, if there's a slowdown in manufacturing, I imagine there's going to be an impact on the kind of shipping between those Asian nations. It's a really difficult situation for shippers to keep a handle on, isn't it? Even if they don't ship or export to or from the US.
Yeah, especially so because they aren't necessarily following it very closely, so they don't know what happens, and the timing's different. So South America, the Far East of South America was still increasing far beyond the decline started coming into the US. So it's an extra tricky thing because it's not directly the demand capacity balance on your trade, and the timing is by no means guaranteed.
Yeah. So very quickly, let's wrap up tariffs because we do talk about it every week and we do want to talk about something else. But just to wrap up tariffs, is this a kind of the most undramatic of the tariff development in terms of the impact that it's going to have on ocean container freight rates for the rest of 2025, in as much as they're going to carry on falling on those main US bound front hauls?
Yeah, I think it's a piece in the puzzle that we were kind of missing because we've been talking for a long time about needing these big trade deals to come in with the EU, with Japan. We're obviously still waiting for China and hearing potentially that tariff pause will be extended for another 90 days. And that also still leaves a lot of uncertainty. But I think this announcement, assuming it all enters into force, and that is not an assumption you can make lightly at the moment. But yeah, this isn't going to suddenly turn around the development in demand that we're seeing on these trades.
Yeah, and going to be a big issue for carriers, but we'll leave that for another freight debate. I think not enough time. Let's talk about backhauls then. That leads us nicely onto backhaul trades, doesn't it? Because we spend so much time, don't we? And we write so much and we talk so much about the major front haul trades, Far East to US or Europe or Mediterranean or South America East Coast. What we don't actually talk about quite so much is the kind of export, the backhaul trades. And yes, they're lower volumes, but for those shippers that are on those trades, they're the most important ones, aren't they? So should we give backhauls a little bit of a rap here and give them some much deserved attention?
Well, the shippers who work heavily with the backhaul trades are probably not too unhappy about the fact that backhauls aren't getting much coverage these days, because actually, I'm not going to say it's easy to work on them, but the conditions are much better for them on the backhauls than they are on the front hauls, and that's been the case basically since the start of 2024, when spot rates exploded on the front haul rates after the Red Sea crisis, but the backhaul rates have stayed much lower. So just for a little bit of context, if you take the first 5 months of the year and demand data, just under half of containers are moved on front hauls. So that's, for example, Far East to US, where obviously there's a lot more containers moved from the Far East into the US than vice versa. And that means that on the backhaul trade, you have basically these big ships that are sailing at much less with a much less intake, and that means that the rates are very, very different. So just under half of global demand is moved on the front hauls, and about 20% is moved on backhauls. The rest is kind of on intra-regional trades, much shorter, but still important volumes. But backhaul rates at the moment on the biggest backhaul trades are very close to, if not at, record low levels, whether that's on the spot or the long-term market. There's been a slight uptick in recent weeks, but we're still at very, very low levels. So if you look at the market mid-low, so the lower end of the market from North Europe to the Far East, it's costing you $70 on that kind of pure rate to move that container, which is absolutely nothing compared to what it is on the front haul rate, and very, very different.
No, I think I paid more than that to get some trainers delivered from somewhere the other week. It's not. It just doesn't make sense, does it, for freight rates to be that low? Incredible.
So there's an element of it that does, and that is that kind of the ships have to go back to the Far East or wherever they're going. That's a given. The containers also have to go back. There are some companies now sort of looking into collapsible containers, which would mean you could transport far more containers in smaller space and you wouldn't have this big problem with empties. But carriers are facing the cost of moving that container back, whether it's loaded or not loaded. So for them, it's trying to kind of gain back the losses there are from loading that container. So the freight rate might be very low, but then you're paying kind of the terminal handling charges. So as a shipper, you're paying that rather than the carrier. And of course, that saves you money. And I'm sure Phil and I had the same question when I joined Xeneta, and we reached the level where backhaul rates were very low and said, how is it possible to have a negative rate? Because that's sometimes what you see on our platform, that the lower end of the market is seeing negative rate. Now, that doesn't mean somebody's paying you to move a container from A to B. That would be nice, but it's not the case. But it is the case that actually, if you then add in the terminal handling charges, you're paying a very small amount still for that container, but you're paying something, and a carrier is covering some of their costs. And that's really the key to them. They have to move these containers anyway. They might as well try and make some of that back.
Yeah. So where are we going with these rates in these backhaul rates? And is it the main front hauls where the backhaul rates are kind of dropping lowest just because there's more volume on those front haul trades?
Yeah, so it's very much about that balance between imports and exports. And to be frank, we were looking into backhauls on the back of kind of this trade war and looking at US exports back out into some of these countries and reciprocal tariffs. And if you look at kind of the balance between US and China, and the statistics are quite wild, but for every loaded exported container from the US to China, there is just over 9 loaded containers, going from China to the US. That's huge. And that's a balance that's deteriorating. Because yes, US imports from China are down in the first 5 months of this year, but actually US exports to China are down even further. And that means that ratio is getting even worse, and carriers are having to transport even more containers empty back to the Far East. And that, of course, puts downward pressure on rates. But this hasn't always been the case. Backhaul rates have also risen to very high levels at other points. So at the moment, what we're seeing really is the spot rate is driven by higher demand on the front haul trades. And the backhaul rates are just not facing that same pressure. And that's a very different situation to what we had during the pandemic, because back then, actually, you had backhaul rates that rose pretty high. In the first months of 2020, it was actually more expensive to ship a container from North Europe to China than the other way. Why was that? Well, it was because Chinese exports basically collapsed in the first few months there of 2020, while Europe was still mostly open and manufacturing and exporting. So suddenly there was not enough room on the backhaul trades because carriers had removed so much capacity on the front hauls. But then sort of longer into the pandemic, the big issue there became a question of equipment. And so for carriers, they were looking at really, really high freight rates in the Far East for exports. And then they were saying, okay, I could either wait around and get some goods to export from the US to China, send the container to some US shipper, some US exporter, wait for them to fill it up and send it back to me and get a certain freight rate. Or I get that container back to the Far East as fast as possible. And that opportunity cost of filling the container rose quite dramatically as freight rates exploded on the front hauls. And that meant that actually the backhaul rates really increased because it had to be attractive for carriers to still take those containers. And that left a lot of exporters out of these typical importer regions suddenly having to pay much higher costs, which is clearly not the case today because it's not the same pressures pushing the markets up.
Yeah, when you talk about equipment as well there, is reefer equipment more impacted by backhauls or front hauls? Is there any correlation there in terms of, I'm just thinking, US exports, kind of, if there's any kind of refrigerated goods, US exports, whether it's, I don't know, fish or whatever, is there kind of more impact in reefer equipment?
So it's interesting because, and now the example that's coming to me here is, if you look at kind of reefer container exports or container movements between the Far East and Europe, the front haul backhaul for reefer is the reverse of the front haul backhaul for dry. So actually there's more reefer containers being sent back to Asia than there is coming from Asia. But again, those containers have to move back. So if there's a lot of pressure on the front haul rate and carriers are having to kind of find a space to put an empty reefer container on one of these high-paying ships to get back to Europe, that's also going to mean that actually you have to pay a higher cost to get that container moved on what is the overall backhaul, but that is the front haul for reefer. So it's slightly different dynamics, and again, it's quite specific to the trade and to the situation, and that it varies quite a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting though, isn't it? Because, and this isn't the freight rates especially, this is just more the cost of importing / exporting. We have talked about tariffs, and we've talked about the cost of importing goods into the US and whether Shippers might send them via Vietnam or Cambodia or Brazil or whatever it is. The same would be true, wouldn't it, of US exporters on those backhaul trades, because it's reciprocal tariffs, but China hit back as well, didn't they? And there was that kind of spiraling trade war. If you're a US exporter to China, you are going to be considering, the freight rate kind of, we can say, well, it's even a negative freight rate, but actually they've been hit big time financially, haven't they? And they will be looking at options, whether it's to export to, processing plants or whatever it may be in regions other than China on the back of these tariffs. So there's going to be that shift in demand on the backhauls as well, isn't there?
Yeah, and just to be clear, you're not going to be paying a negative rate when you look at the all-in cost, but it can be very, very low. But and again, there it becomes a question more of what is the demand on that trade. So if you think back to the first trade war, when it was the US and China, the US exports to China are very agricultural heavy. And again, coming back to kind of soybeans being the major commodity. And China, in a way that most other economies can say, actually, okay, we're stopping those imports. So you saw very, very quickly China saying as little as possible from the US, and suddenly their imports from Brazil of soybeans exploded because they were able to match that. And that's not something most countries can sort of dictate and say, hey, everybody who imports soybeans, let's move where you import from. So there again, it becomes a question of, okay, what is the Chinese demand for US goods? And of course, that's going to be hurt by any reciprocal tariffs, but also just by kind of the escalating tensions that will also have an impact. And for carriers, that all means that they're going to be losing more money on the backhauls because they have even fewer containers loaded on the ships and that have to go back anyway.
Yeah. Let's try and be helpful. We always try and be helpful. We talk about so much stuff on the freight debate, but maybe it sometimes gets lost what Xeneta actually does. We are essentially an ocean and air freight intelligence platform. So let's kind of put that expertise, your expertise, to good use in relation to the backhaul trades. If you're a shipper and you ship goods from the US to China, and you ship goods from China to the US, so you use the front haul and the back haul, can you use that to your advantage in other words, if you're talking to a carrier and you can commit to filling up volumes on the backhaul trades that would otherwise be essentially empty, that even though it's a lower freight rate, there's a definite value to the carrier there, presumably, that you can then use to your advantage in your procurement of your rates on the front haul. Is that logical?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of those ways, and we've spoken about it before, when the pressure picks up, that you want to be a shipper of choice for that carrier. And you can do that by having sort of living up to your volume commitments and all the rest. But you can also do it by providing containers on trades where they need to fill up their ships. And that would be one obvious example. And I think, just coming back to Xeneta on our platform, we're also guilty of it. But we talk a lot about those major front haul trades that are really moving things in shipping. But the reality is there are different dynamics everywhere. And Xeneta customers can obviously go in at any time and say, actually, I can hear all this and this is everything that's in the media, but I can see on my trades that the situation is different. So I can go straight back to my carrier and say, yeah, but on this trade, this isn't relevant, and therefore we shouldn't be going to that kind of price level.
Sure. And not just differences across trades, but let's say you ship quite high volume from, I don't know, Vancouver to Cambodia, just as an example. And you also ship from Shanghai to Vancouver. Two separate trades, one front haul, one back haul. If you use that backhaul volume to your advantage for your front haul rates, whatever you see in the media in terms of average spot rates are doing this, for example, on the front haul trade, you might have negotiated a rate for your trade from Shanghai to Vancouver that's at a lower level, and you may say that I don't recognize the rate that I'm reading in Bloomberg or whatever it is. Everyone occupies the market that's visible to them, don't they? And actually, again, shameless plug for Xeneta here, but that's the point, isn't it? That if you don't have the visibility of the market, you only see your own rates, don't you?
Yeah, you only see your own rates and you only see the headlines. And you need something that kind of makes it make sense, because often those two things just simply don't compute.
Yeah. And again, that goes, on for the backhaul trades as well, doesn't it? Because presumably there's fewer rates on backhaul trades than there are on the front haul trades. So, your rates, it's harder for you to get a grasp of what you should be paying, I suppose, on the backhauls and how you can use that to your advantage on the front hauls.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. I feel like we've been helpful, Emily.
Well, we'll have to see. I don't think we can decide that.
We will have to see. But I think to kind of wrap this up and try and come full circle, we did say at the start that we were going to talk about backhauls, and we always wanted to talk about backhauls because it's the child that isn't they're sat in the corner and doesn't get the attention. But it is part of this tapestry of global ocean container shipping, isn't it? And yes, we did talk about tariffs, but you can trace those, you can join those dots, can't you? About, what's the impact of tariffs on the front haul trades? And you can see how that kind of ripples into backhaul trades or ripples into South America, East Coast. It's all one melting pot of kind of volatility at the moment, isn't it?
And I can guarantee that there'll be plenty of more time to talk about tariffs in the coming weeks and months, however much we want to or don't want to.
Well, we've got to. This is the thing. We said we're going to talk about backhalls today, but then we kind of got together, and just for listeners and viewers' benefit, we've been pedal to the metal today, haven't we? Trying to keep up with what's going on. So we do try and share this as quickly as we can and give you good insights. But yeah, you're right. Whatever the outcome is of the China-US discussions in Stockholm that are happening as we speak will be of interest, and it's the big story. So we will continue to talk about it, but try and add in some variety, whether it's backhauls or we could talk about next time is the challenges carriers are going to face in light of these falling spot rates. Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. As always, hope you, all our listeners to the Freight Debate, found that interesting and insightful, and for once maybe even helpful with Emily's advice on using backhauls to help your negotiations in your front haul procurement. So if you found that interesting and you enjoyed it, please hit subscribe. We'll be joined again by Emily in the next edition of the Freight Debate. Until then, thank you and good luck negotiating the tariffs.